In parts 1 and 2 of this series of videos, I describe 19 mistakes and breakages that occurred during seasons 1 and 2 of my sailing Sea Change, my 1989 Pacific Seacraft, around the world alone. Here are the last 11 such events. Number 20. The Australian Border Force in Bundaberg. When I was ready to leave Vanuatu and sail across to Australia, I was well aware of the reputation of the Australian Border Force for their strict regulations and expectations of visiting cruisers. I filled in the required advance notice of arrival before leaving Vanuatu, as the Iridium email at sea could not handle forms, but had a brain fart and said I would arrive at Cairns in 3 weeks, when the 1,000-mile passage would probably take less than 10 days. Including a brief stop at Ilhuon at the north end of New Caledonia and 2 nights in Chesterfield Reef, which is also a New Caledonia territory, that is indeed how long it took. The circles on my tracker here indicate posts to my blog, usually made each evening. While I was in Chesterfield Reef, the forecast began to suggest stronger conditions to the north on my proposed path to Cairns. So I asked Christina to email the form again to change my arrival port to Bundaberg, which is considerably further south. The form required that you specify date and even time of arrival, which is simple for a ship, but near impossible for a sailboat still several days out. So I asked her to put down 1 p.m. on Friday, June 28, 2024. It turned out that I had pretty good conditions and arrived on Thursday evening, and seeing an anchorage marked on my chart just before the marina, decided to go in and anchored for the night, not even thinking that I should notify the ABF. The next morning I called up the marina and asked when I could come and check in, and they replied that I was only expected that afternoon at 1, and wondered where I was. When I explained I was anchored around the corner from the marina, they were rather distressed and said they would consult with the ABF. An hour later, they got back to me and relayed that the ABF said I could come to their quarantine dock in the morning, but could not step off the boat until they arrived. And so, precisely at 1 p.m., 3 officers arrived and spent 2 hours on board. While one grilled me about my sail from Vanuatu and before, another examined every pill bottle I had for my 6 prescriptions, and there were lots of them, as I still had a 9-month supply on board. And the third turned the inside of Sea Change upside down, presumably looking for drugs. Perhaps they thought it possible I had anchored the night before to offload some, and when they heard I had bought the boat in Panama, their interest intensified. Perhaps because it turned out they had a major cocaine drug bust of a Panamanian boat that had arrived from Vanuatu a few months earlier. The marina office explained that my strange initial arrival date, followed by changing my arrival port, followed by anchoring without notifying the ABF, had resulted in the unusually intense boat search. As it happened, I had a small amount of fentanyl that a friend who was battling cancer gave me, as she could not tolerate it, just in case I broke a bone or something similarly painful. And knowing that drug would pique the interest of any customs officer, I hid it very well, and happily they did not find it. Number 21. Pancake Creek grounding. My first stop after Bundaberg was a popular river anchorage called Pancake Creek, with an interesting history connected to the nearby lighthouse on Busted Head on the south bank. As I entered the mouth of the river and started motoring up it, I got confused about the buoys and markers. At first, there were some large round buoys on my port side that were obviously mooring buoys with pennants, the anchorage indicated on the chart here, which seemed somewhat exposed to the strong conditions we were forecast to endure there, so I continued upriver towards where a few more boats were moored or anchored. However, I noticed a set of triangular buoys to my left and started over towards them to investigate, not knowing that these mark rocks and reefs because I had not read my guide to this coast properly. Distracted by these buoys, I also failed to notice that I had now departed from the deep channel indicated by red markers, and eventually we were aground. Now I had been aground before in mud and on sand, but this was the first time on rock or reef. It was very unsettling, but fortunately the tide was coming in, and I patiently waited about 15 minutes till we finally floated free, and before the incoming current could run us up further on the rocks, backed off to the marked channel. This was perhaps the biggest mistake of my circumnavigation, because when it came time for the haul out as part of the survey my potential buyer in Florida paid for the next year, the smile at the joint of the lead keel to the fiberglass keel stub on the bottom of the hull was rather pronounced, and the buyer was able to use this to beat down the price significantly. Number 22. Tears in the leech of the mainsail. The first tear of the mainsail occurred during my initial Pacific passage, and I repaired it in Nukuhiva by sewing a patch of sailcloth over it. I soon gave up that approach and started to use sticky sail tape, sometimes with additional stitching using a speedy stitcher to secure it. By the time I got to Cairns, I had many such repairs all the way up the leech. There, previous owners Shane Dennis and Mary Lawson assisted me in getting the full-length battens out of the sail, and at their home, Mary gave me some extra-wide sail tape, with which we covered all those patches along the entire length of the leech. I later discovered that I could buy even wider and strong sail tape from sail lofts, and used it repeatedly, including to repair a final long tear on the leech of the main inside of all the others, suffered in a squall off West Caicos Island. I have to admit that this sail was in bad shape by the time I got to Florida, but was proud to have finished my circumnavigation with it. I bent on a spare mainsail I'd carried around the world for the sea trial requested by the chap who purchased Sea Change, but failed to take a picture of it. Number 23. The engine oil leak. During Season 2, I noticed that the cutlery in a drawer on the port side of the galley was rusting, apparently as a result of somehow getting wet with seawater. Eventually, I found the seawater was coming from the valve at the top of the anti-siphon loop for the bilge pump, the hose for which ran behind this drawer and exited on the port side of the hull. This valve is designed to allow air to enter to prevent a siphon from being generated that could potentially swamp the boat, but not allow the water being pumped out by the bilge pump to escape. It was surely original to the boat, and is a fairly delicate plastic part that had hardened and warped, and now was spitting water out and into the drawer whenever the bilge pump ran, which was becoming common as the stuffing box on the propeller shaft had bottomed out and could not be tightened further, and hence leaked quite badly, something I fixed in New Zealand along with the transmission and motor mounts. About the same time, I noticed that the engine was becoming corroded on the top, especially on the starboard side, and could often find seawater drops on it. I ascribed this to the raw seawater pump that was leaking, although it was not obvious how this water could get to the side and top of the engine. It took me far too long to realize that this issue was also caused by a leaking anti-siphon loop valve, this time the one for the incoming seawater hose, which went up and down on the starboard side of the engine compartment, unfortunately with the siphon loop itself high enough to be hidden behind the inside of the cockpit. In New Zealand, I eventually changed both of these loops for new ones like this, as well as the leaking seawater pump. The loops were cheap, the pump was $800. This corrosion led to a nearly disastrous failure, because later that season, after the major passage across the Indian Ocean, shortly after leaving the little harbor at Port Mathurin on Rodrigues via a narrow channel cut in the fringing reef, the low engine oil pressure alarm sounded, so I immediately shut the engine down. I had just exited the channel, which faces northeast into the trades, and had turned northwest and unfurled the jib. But now the fringing reef was on my left and close by, so it was imperative that we managed to sail out to sea with just the jib as I was hand steering. From there I sailed to the extraordinary Corgadas Carajos shoals to the northwest, and for the first time anchored under sail. Then I continued southwest to Mauritius, where I could not get into the harbor at Port Louis to check in properly, as it would be upwind and they frown on boats sailing in. So with the help of Ralph on Z, who came out to guide me in, I sailed into Grand Bay and anchored under sail there too. I declared force majeure, and the officials all came to the boat to check me in. By briefly running the engine with more oil added, it was quickly obvious that the oil was spurting out of an external oil line on the starboard side of the engine, a region I now realized was really badly corroded. There is an annoying backstory to this external oil line, which is apparently that the block for this Yanmar 3-cylinder engine was designed by hand before CAD was available. And when they did early tests of it, they discovered a few places where there was insufficient oil delivery. So instead of redesigning it, they bodged it by adding this external oil pipe that takes oil from the port side of the engine and leads it to 3 points on the rear and starboard side. Each of these points is what is known as a banjo bolt that allows oil to enter the block and also continue down the oil line. The oil is of course under considerable pressure, so even this pinhole near the second of these 3 banjo bolts quickly emptied the engine. In Mauritius, I paid for a pair of young mechanics from the local marine shop to come out to sea change at anchor and give me a quote for either fixing the line or building a new one, but it would take them at least a week. So instead, I decided on my own bodge of a bodge, which was to bung a metal epoxy called JB Weld on the joint between the banjo bolt and the pipe. My first attempt seemed to work, so I set off from Mauritius for the complicated 16-day passage to South Africa, but eventually it leaked enough to require more oil. Incredibly stupidly, I had not picked up an extra jug of new oil, but I had the old oil from a previous oil change, so I added that, but turned off the bilge pump so that I would not lose it all, and added more JB Weld. Even then, it eventually leaked some more, leading to one of the more ridiculous situations of my circumnavigation. Down on my knees on the cabin sole, carefully ladling out the leaked engine oil from the bilge, where it was well separated from the seawater below, to add back into the engine. We eventually made it to Richards Bay like this, where I changed the oil, added still more JB Weld, and eventually made it to Cape Town, where the Yanmar dealer ordered the entire external oil pipe assembly from England. Number 24. Broken Pushput. The sail to Cogadas Carajos Shoals was fairly gentle, but the trip back to Mauritius was much rougher, and about halfway across I noticed that the welds at the bottom of the rear uprights on the pushput had broken, and the welds higher up in the pushput were separating. In retrospect, this was not too surprising. After all, the boat was now 35 years old, and I had considerable weight on that pushput, including the 2 outboard engines and the stern anchor. In addition, the entire bimini and the large solar panel above it were supported by the pushput, so this was a serious issue. Obviously, I could not repair it at sea, so I did my best to tie those vertical stainless steel tubes back to the deck. In Mauritius, I hired a local welder to re-weld these 2 brakes at the aft bottom legs of the pushput, plus reinforce the other 4 welds on the aft part of the pushput. The forward parts of the pushput showed no evidence of a problem, but nevertheless I removed the outboards from the pushput and kept them strapped securely in the cabin on long passages after that. Number 25. The wind vane line comes loose in the Indian Ocean. Midway on the passage from Mauritius to South Africa, as described in more detail in my video on Roughest Nights Part 2, I was sailing under the storm staysail alone, in strong conditions, when around midnight it became obvious something was wrong, as we kept heading up instead of holding a broad-reaching course in strong northeast wind. In the dark, I could not figure out what the problem was, so to keep us on course, I rolled out a little of the 100% jib and backed it to push the bow down. Over the next 4 hours, I continued to fight with this issue, and around 4 a.m. I finally realized that the primary line holding one of the relay pulleys for the wind vane had come loose, shown here the next morning, so it was held only by a backup line that was too slack. The doubled line here is my replacement the next morning. This was neither a mistake nor a breakage, just a failure of the knot, as it had worked loose at an unfortunate time during rough conditions. I eventually dropped the storm sail completely and continued under a sliver of the jib. Number 26. Tiller Autopilot Breakages. The mechanical ram for the Raymarine EV100 Tiller Autopilot is poorly built, with hard plastic ends where it attaches to the tiller and to the cockpit coaming. These had repeatedly broken over the years, and I had bodged them as shown here for each end, as a replacement costs $1,500. During my final season, the issue came to a head as my third repair of the cockpit coaming end failed. I decided to make a truly secure connection at this end, but unfortunately never took a decent picture of it. But in the process, I compromised the waterproofing of that end, which is essential, as the innards of the ram involve an electric motor that would be instantly corroded by seawater. So from then on, I had to protect the ram with a plastic bag. Number 27. 2 failed alternators. Alternators are well known to regularly fail on sailboats, the marine environment being particularly harsh for them, so most boats carry at least one spare. So when mine failed in Fiji in Season 2, I was ready with a spare. However, in Season 4, while motoring into Tobago to anchor, I smelt burning rubber and saw smoke coming from the engine compartment, so quickly shut it down. The problem turned out to be the engine belt that is driven by a large pulley on the crankshaft and then drives both the freshwater pump at the top of the engine and the alternator on the left side. I had an infrared thermometer, and the belt and alternator pulley were extremely hot and the belt was smoking. I managed to keep the problem under control by using only idle speed into the anchorage. However, later when I then sailed to Trinidad, there was no way I would be able to get through the pass to the marinas there. So my friend Donald Stolmeyer came out with his motorboat and towed me in, my third and final tow into a marina. I do not understand what the problem was, but in Cape Town I had purchased a generic alternator as a spare, but it had significantly different wiring connections at the rear, requiring some bodging, including the field wire in black with blue terminals here, and the pulley for the fan belt on the front required considerable modification too. Number 28. UV protection for the 100% jib. Before I set off from Panamarina, Christelle and Jacob Reed, amongst so many other projects, helped me by reinforcing the blue UV strip on the leech of the 130% Genoa. At the time, although I had used the 100% jib on the second shakedown cruise to the San Blas Islands, I did not imagine that I would use it for most of the circumnavigation, so did not ask them to add a UV protective strip to its leech and foot. Worse, when I left that torn jib with the North Loft in Opua for repair, it did not occur to me to ask for the addition of a UV protective strip. This oversight came back to plague me as we sailed up the South Atlantic and eventually Caribbean Sea in Season 4, as small tears started to form in both the leech and foot. I eventually used my remaining supply of long, wide sail tape at Martinique 4 years late to reinforce and UV protect the leech. Oh, it's the 29th of May, and I've been stuck here in Martinique for almost a week because I picked up a stomach bug. Mostly recovered now, and I've used the time to finally put the equivalent of a UV resistant strip up the leech of the jib in sections, because it's got a curve and it's also hard to do long strips at a time. And the reason for getting going with this is a tear that I had to repair quite significantly there on the leech. Speedy Stitcher is coming in very useful. And I'm going to take the advantage to clean the jib a little bit as well, and then get it up. It's been light winds, which has been nice. Here's the final product underway, top left, and later I also did the foot of the jib. In addition, I restitched all of the reinforcement layers at the clew with the Speedy Stitcher. Number 29. Water leaks. Water leaks on boats are a perpetual problem, especially on older boats. The two main hatches in the cabin roof always leaked, with the forward one not being that big a problem, as when underway it was covered by the inverted dinghy. But the center one dripped water regularly, which I would avoid landing on my bunk while trying to sleep by rigging a towel as a curtain. Eventually in Cape Town we pried out the plexiglass in that hatch, and Christina kindly cleaned it all up and resealed it, which helped a lot. The portholes also leaked, sometimes quite badly, and I tried several temporary solutions, including plastic bags on the inside, and even the bottom of an old plastic oil can over the worst one. I eventually found the correct gasket material for them in Trinidad and replaced all the gaskets, which were original and hard and cracked, which helped a lot, but ultimately all of them needed to be removed completely, rebuilt and rebedded, a task I was not up for. I experienced all sorts of other leaks, one of which was deterioration of the caulking under the water-fill opening on the starboard side deck, which allowed seawater to come down inside the back of the electrical panel, not the best thing, and eventually managed to reseal that one. Even the water tanks leaked, albeit this was only fresh water, so I tried to seal them better, but it was never perfect, and I only filled the tanks halfway, not needing much fresh water and used only for washing, as all my drinking water was in gallon jugs on the cabin sole. Number 30. Head and stove. When I bought Sea Change, the head was in pretty bad shape, and it only got worse over the 2 years she sat on a mooring at Panamarina during 2020 and 2021. By mid-2021 it had stopped working, and I paid a German cruiser named Armin on the right here, with a trimaran on the neighboring mooring, to recondition it with a gasket and seal kit. It therefore worked for the second of our San Blas shakedown cruises with Christina and Erica on board, our canal crossing with 4 others on board, and in Fakarava when Christina and Erica visited. However, I did not use it after that, preferring a bucket in the cockpit because I preferred the view, and also because any time I went forward in the boat when underway, I would start to feel queasy, and the idea of using the head up there was uninviting. The downside was that when I came to sell Sea Change, the head was not functioning properly, and it took a whole day of taking it apart to get it functional. The stove was even worse. I did not use the oven to cook, instead kept eggs in it, and only used the aft burner a few times on the initial Pacific crossing to cook pasta. After that, I used only the forward burner and a small frying pan. Hence, when it came time to sell Sea Change, I could not get the aft burner or the oven to work, and broke both of them trying to. Hence, another $2,000 reduction in agreed purchase price. Both of these issues were obviously avoidable if I had regularly used and maintained this equipment. An old boat will inevitably have numerous problems, and I was not always the best at keeping up with maintenance. But with a modicum of bodging skills, I was able to keep Sea Change sailing for more than 25,000 miles to complete my circumnavigation here in Florida.